Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dee Dee Lageson, Executive Secretary for the Committee on the Present Danger China. We appreciate your interest in our weekly webinars, in which we expose and analyze the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against America and the help being provided to the CCP in waging that warfare by captured U.S. elites. We encourage you to visit presentdangerchina.org for information on our programs, access to videos of our past webinars, and tons of other very valuable content. Subscribe to our Substack at presentdangerchina.substack.com and follow us on X at CPDChina. For today's webinar, select the Q&A from your navigation bar to make comments or ask questions, and open up the chat for important resources we will share. Our moderator today is Frank Gaffney. Frank is president of the Institute for the American Future, vice chair for the Committee on the Present Danger China, and host of Securing America on Real America's Voice Network. Frank, let's get started in 3, 2, 1.
Thank you, Dee Dee. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the weekly series that our Committee on the Present Danger China presents as part of our effort to raise awareness about the unrestricted warfare that the Chinese communists have engaged in for decades, unbeknownst to most of us, and with devastating effect. We're going to experiment with a slightly different format than those of you who've been subscribing to these programs have experienced to date, in the hope that we will be able to present some of the people you've come to know well as a result of their generous participation in these programs and have some familiarity, I think, with their viewpoints. We're going to encourage more of a conversation between them and thereby hopefully not only further illuminate some of their important ideas and recommendations, but also make it a bit more engaging, perhaps, than set piece remarks. We will do our best to cover the waterfront of issues that we think are at present very much in need of this kind of scrutiny. One involving the status of Xi Jinping, a man who was essentially anointed the emperor for life by the Chinese Communist Party a few years ago. There are indications, and we'll discuss them, that he may be losing his grip on power. There are countervailing indications as well, and we'll explore where the truth may lie. We're also going to be talking about what he has done to amass capabilities that might be, in his view, especially if he's going down, sufficient to achieve the kinds of ambitions vis-a-vis Taiwan, yes, but others in the region, and most especially us as well. And whether the turmoil that is clearly taking place in China, the economic, the political, the demographic, could precipitate in perhaps the not too distant future another form of warfare beyond the unrestricted kind, a shooting war. And we may well find ourselves embroiled in it should that happen. So we're going to talk about what we need to be thinking and doing with respect to all of this, with what I consider to be the A team of our Committee on the Present Danger China and friends, as I'm fond of calling them. We have with us Gordon Chang. I'm going to introduce them all just very briefly. You know them, I think, by now. He is a Senior Distinguished Fellow with the Gatestone Institute and the author most recently of Plan Red, China's project to take down America. We have with us as well Captain James Fennell, United States Navy retired, the former Chief of Intelligence and Information Operations at the U.S. Pacific Fleet, also an author. His book, co-authored with Dr. Bradley Thayer, is Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure. We have in addition Colonel John Mills, United States Army retired, author as well, among others, of Deep State, The War Against the Deep State, forgive me, a very personal insider's view as to what we're up against in that regard. We have another 06, now retired, Marine Corps Colonel Grant Newsham, a very accomplished practitioner, both in uniform as well as a Foreign Service officer and now businessman in East Asia. He too has a book, a very important one. I think it's titled When China Attacks, a Warning to America. Brian Kennedy, the chairman of our Committee on the Present Danger China, is with us. He is a former president of the Claremont Institute, now president of the American Strategy Group, and the author of, among other things, The Communist China's War Inside America. And finally, Dr. Karen Sigeman, last but certainly not least. Dr. Sigeman is a woman who has served our country with distinction during the Cold War as one of our specialists out of uniform in the anti-submarine warfare space. These days, she runs a tremendously important group, the American Freedom Alliance in California. I think she's an author too, but I don't have her book at hand, but she will be perhaps shedding light on her work in that space as well as others. Anyway, the A-Team, and I want to thank also our colleagues who make all of this possible, Didi Logason, whom you've just seen, and Oleg Atbashian as well, our technical backstopper. So we're going to try this experiment, and I want to start by asking Gordon Chang to say a little bit about the evidence of Xi's somewhat uncertain status. Gordon, please read us in on what you make of it all at the moment.
Well, thanks, Frank and Didi. The preponderance of evidence suggests that Xi Jinping has lost influence recently. There's all sorts of assessments, from Xi Jinping is going to formally lose his post in August, to he's going to be kept on as a figurehead, to others that will say that he is weakened but will stay on for quite a long time with his post, and some who say he's as strong as ever. But the infighting in China right now is most clearly seen in the People's Liberation Army. Since July 9th of last year, there have been 3 articles in PLA Daily, which is the propaganda organ of the Chinese military, that praise, quote unquote, collective leadership. Now, this is a phrase which is a direct slap at Xi Jinping's style of governance, because Xi Jinping has one-man rule, as we all know, but he's also demanded complete obedience to the party, and he's demanded that the party show complete obedience to him. Now, these articles could not have appeared in PLA Daily if Xi Jinping controlled the military. There are reports that these articles are actually written by officers, military officers, and others who are loyal to General Zhang Youshao, who is the first vice chairman of the Communist Party's Central Military Commission and China's #1 uniformed officer. And there are many rumors about General Zhang's unhappiness with Xi Jinping. We have seen some personnel changes that suggest that Xi Jinping has in fact lost control of the Chinese military, not just influence. So, for instance, Xi Jinping's #1 loyalist in the military, who is a vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, #2 uniformed officer, that is General He Weidong. He has not been seen in public since March 11th, at the end of the so-called 2 sessions. Now, there are rumors that he actually is no longer alive, that he was suicided in the 301 hospital in Beijing in May, along with another Xi Jinping loyalist. And there's been a number of commentaries that said that Xi Jinping sacked his own guy. And General He was absolutely critical to Xi Jinping in the military, because he was the hatchet man for China's leader. I actually don't think that that is right, given what we've seen with those PLA daily articles and with other Xi loyalists also being removed from power. And that suggests that Xi Jinping is no longer in effective control of China's military, which, by the way, is the most powerful faction in the Communist Party. On the other side, on the civilian side, there is also evidence suggesting that Xi has lost influence, although here there is less corroboration. But clearly, Xi Jinping disappeared for 2 weeks this spring. When he came back, he has not been portrayed in state media in the same light as he was before, with the exception of what happened on Monday. And I'll explain that in a few moments. You know, normally Xi Jinping is shown in state media as giving directions to the Standing Committee or the Politburo, and people clap and all the rest of it. That has not been evident in state media since April 25. He has been shown, but he's been shown in ways which clearly show that he has lost influence. And that is, of course, problems for Xi Jinping. On July 13th, he actually gave a speech at an event commemorating the 120th anniversary of Chen Yun, who was a statesman during the Maoist and the Deng eras. And Xi Jinping was forced to praise, quote unquote, collective leadership, which was startling. Also, when state media showed this event, they did not show anyone clapping for Xi Jinping, which I think is important. Now, the other thing that has really sort of got people's attention around the world to Xi Jinping's troubles is the announcement that he's not going to the BRICS summit in Brazil. Xi Jinping has never missed one of these. The reason given was that he has seen the Brazilian president, Lula da Silva, already this year, so he doesn't need to see him again. But that's not credible for any number of reasons, which we really don't have time to go into. But it's clear that Xi Jinping should have gone to that. Now, not all the evidence says that Xi Jinping is lost. We saw on Monday state and party media carry his remarks to the Politburo, the 24-member Politburo, talking about various essentially unimportant matters. But it did show Xi in a more important light than has been shown since April 25. When you put all of this together, it shows that there is turmoil in the party. Now, this is not to say that Xi Jinping is lost. You know, Xi Jinping's a strongman. And we have seen in prior eras with Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, the two other strongmen in the communist era, they have sometimes been exiled. They've sometimes been sidelined. They came back. So Xi Jinping can come back as well. But the one thing that we can say for sure is that the Chinese regime right now is racked by intense infighting. And clearly the political system, at this moment at least, maybe not for long, but at least at this moment, China's political system is not stable.
Gordon, thank you very much for that comprehensive treatment. Just one corrective, I believe you said July 13th. Did you mean June 13th? The speech
no, the Chen Yun thing was July 13th.
July 13th of last year.
Of this year.
July 13th.
Oh, sorry, so June 13th. You're right.
June 13th. Okay, good.
You're right.
Oh, correct him. Thank you. I want to get others' comments on this. John Mills, I know you have to leave early, so I did want to give you a chance to make a put before you go on this topic if you want, or perhaps on the preparations as you see them that Xi has put into place for a shooting war.
Well, yeah, Frank, I think it was inevitable that sooner or later, Gordon has outlined it brilliantly, what has been going on. It is going on inside the top levels of the Central Military Commission and the Chinese Communist Party. It was inevitable that somebody like General Zhang would step up when you see all of your predecessors being disappeared. Sooner or later, a group is going to come together that is going to put their foot down. Now, Gordon has outlined essentially 3, maybe 4 options of what is really going on. I don't think General Shang and his group would want to disappear totally Xi Jinping, but I think they'd want to still demonstrate a certain amount of stability, but definitely dissatisfaction with Xi and what's going on. And so I think this is a more graceful way to assert control rather than an abrupt change, which would be catastrophic and could set off all kinds of things inside. I don't think this slows down what I call essentially the world on fire and the advancement to the final kinetic phase with China versus the United States. I don't think that necessarily stops that, but I think it does change the dynamic. And I think also one thing that has led to this is not just the disappearances of all the military leadership that Xi has carried out, but I think it's also an honest, frank assessment of the no limits agreement, originally with Russia, but you have to also include Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, South Africa, and even Pakistan, is what is the return on investment for China been so far? Well, let's look at it. The first step of the no limits agreement was for Russia to take Ukraine in 72 hours, and 3.5 years later, here we are. So Russia has made some advances, but has also achieved horrific losses. And now you have North Koreans on the battlefield. You even have Chinese being identified on the battlefield, very concerning. But you also have Russia would not be in the game if it wasn't for massive war material support really, really coming from China, even though China blames North Korea or blames Iran. All the machine tools come from China, but this is a China-directed war material support. Now you have Iran greatly degraded. So now the war material from Iran is now in question. So I think that's in the assessment, in the frank assessment of the Chinese senior military leaders. It's not only their own hides that they are concerned about. It's like, what have we gotten out of this so far? Again, that doesn't say that they're not moving forward toward a final kinetic showdown with America. I think all other indicators are a go on this, but they want to handle it differently. And frankly, the no limits agreement, the hard return on investment is questionable with Russia enfeebled, with Iran now severely degraded. Now they've taken, and Gordon and I and Grant have covered the situation in South Korea. A good event is now occurring with the civil gatherings inside of South Korea, questioning the outcome of the June 3rd election, which was definitely a steal, led by Wang Huning, and they are actually now actively announcing his name in South Korea, which has now elicited a response from the corrupt South Korean media, very closely controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. A good turn of events. Name and shame, that's always the best strategy. And now that name has been announced as essentially the Chinese quarterback of the steal, I think it's changing the dynamic a bit inside of South Korea. So they pulled a fast one on us while we were focused on Taiwan. They stole the South Korean election, but at the same time, so that's our right flank of the first island chain. You have to look at South Korea and Japan as our right flank of the first island chain when facing China. But at the same time, the reverse is true. Now, China has potentially lost their left flank when facing the Middle East and Europe, with essentially the catastrophic losses that Iran has incurred when faced with Israel and now some American strikes. So now Iran is in question, and they're conducting essentially a mini Berlin airlift to try to stabilize. We don't know what's going in, and Gordon has pointed that out. We don't know what's going in on these oftentimes 747s. Interesting choice of aircraft. You could get them relatively cheap on the international market, low mileage, good condition, and we don't know how many China has. They're flying in a lot of stuff. They're actually also bringing out a lot of their advisors. They have an extremely large footprint of advisors in Iran. So they're conducting a mini Berlin airlift to try and stabilize, support, and evacuate personnel from Iran. And Iran totally collapses. That's 25% at a minimum, 25% of China's energy off the table. Huge loss, compounding all the other pressures. And China's trying to establish an iron triangle of both pipelines and also rail infrastructure between China, Iran, and Russia, so they can move goods and products and oil and refined product outside of the choke points that the American Navy, once it gets back up at fighting strength, can pinch off. But I don't think they're going to be able to get this iron triangle of pipelines and rail network in place fast enough. It's going to take years and decades to get this a reliable infrastructure. So immense pressure, and sooner or later, a group of general admirals was going to come together and put their foot down with Xi and says, we're done with this disappearing thing. And I think they've chosen the option not to do an abrupt change, not to necessarily disappear Xi, but clearly they have him under their control. I think that's what's in many ways what's going on, and I don't think that necessarily stops their plans on Taiwan or the final stage of the kinetic showdown, but it does significantly change the dynamic.
John Mills, thank you so much, and again, appreciate you being with us for the time you couldn't be. Let me turn to Captain James Fennell. Jim, a lot of this is the business of intelligence. I'd be very interested in your thoughts on both what we've heard from Gordon in terms of the lay of the land, and also just one point of clarification. I think John indicated that Xi was doing the purging. It sounds as though it's Xi's people who were being purged as well. If you can help clarify that, and anything you would like to say about the capabilities for war that John's just alluded to as well.
Well, thanks, Frank, for letting me be a part of this. It's an honor and privilege, and glad to be with such a distinguished group. Gordon and I frequently talked about this issue of where is Xi in his position of power, and I'd like to offer maybe an alternative view. I would direct folks after this is over, if you would like to look up an article that was written on June 25th for the website Sino Insider. It's entitled, "Xi is Losing Power, or Is He?" And in that article, they specifically addressed this issue that Gordon brought up about the PLA Daily's series of articles that talked about taking the lead in upholding collective leadership as being one of the main evidences that Xi is under duress by the PLA and the party because of the situation in China. And they basically say that the piece that was commented on, this series of pieces, were part of a group of articles, 4 of them, that were covering basically the larger issue of consciously setting an example about adhering to democratic centralism, and that collective leadership is part of this subset of, or is a subset of, the democratic centralism, which is not democracy or a check on authoritarianism, but is rather a Leninist organizational system emphasizing the unified central leadership of the party, a tool that the party has also used to curb internal corruption. And so the assessment from this writer, and I agree with this writer, is that this series of articles actually represents that the PLA is in compliance with Xi Jinping's directives rather than a challenge, and that by upholding collective leadership was part of a political campaign initiated by Xi's leadership. And the conclusion that should be drawn from that statement is that Xi's power and authority are fully intact, not diminished or in dispute. And the article goes on to address other issues that Gordon mentioned about where was he, why didn't he show up for things, and the number of times that he's mentioned in an article and all of that. And we can discuss those. But really, for me as a military intelligence person, I have to measure also what I see from the PLA. And so if I just look over the last year and I see the kinds of things that the PLA has been doing, I don't see a PLA in conflict in terms of their product. They just have had 2 aircraft carriers operating east of the first and second island chain. The Liaoning carrier operated east of the second island chain, the first time in the People's Republic of China's history. They operated 2 carriers, one west of the second island chain, one east, basically bracketing Guam. They've been active in the South China Sea. They seized Sandy Cay earlier in the year, putting their Chinese flag down, saying it's their territory when it had been our treaty ally, the Republic of the Philippines. They've also been continuing the sea trials of their 4th aircraft carrier, the Fujian, that's got this new electromagnetic aircraft launch and recovery system. They've circumnavigated Australia in the last 6 months. PLA was out in the Middle East conducting varsity operations with air-to-air refueling from their new tanker, the Y-20, with Egyptian Air Force MiG-29s. This is something that's rather remarkable. So across the board, and last year, at the end of last year, they built and unveiled a new amphibious Type 076 45,000-ton drone carrier that's going to be able to do fixed wing operations, both manned and unmanned, and also conduct amphibious operations from a single big deck. It's remarkable, and it's also equipped with the electromagnetic aircraft launch system. So across the spectrum, whether it's the PLA Navy, the Air Force, the rocket forces, space, they continue to move forward and advance on a trajectory that Xi has been in charge of for the last 13 years. And so I see that the risk that there's a kind of a cottage industry that's come up here especially in the last 3 or 4 months because of these purging of some of these officers, is that there's this push to identify Xi as losing power, and I think there's a risk to that. And part of it is natural. We have a lot of people that are, Chinese nationals that are outside of China. They're against the Communist Party, and they're rightly, they dislike Xi, and so they're self-affirming and self-perpetuating a view that is almost aspirational in some senses. I don't disagree that there are problems. We just had on the June 27th, we had another Vice Admiral, Li Hanjun, the Chief of Staff for the PLA Navy, was sacked. This is another admiral that's been sacked, but the China Maritime Studies Institute up in Newport came to the conclusion that the removal of Admiral Hanjun would suggest that Xi believes he can burn through a tremendous amount of talent to make the PLA into a force he envisions. If Xi continues to feel he can afford this price, then we must consider the possibility that a degree of military leadership churn is priced into his approach to building a world-class Navy, and I would say the PLA in general. And then the last thing I would say is that there's some risk to this kind of a view of that Xi is under pressure and he's going to fall apart, because it feeds this idea that it's Xi, anti-Xi perspective versus anti-Chinese Communist Party. And so we kind of fixate on Xi and we forget that we got to be worried about the Chinese Communist Party. If Xi goes away, are we going to get somebody that's going to be different? That somebody's going to have a different objective? I don't think so. We also have to worry about the risk that this means for our government agencies, our businesses, Wall Street. Will they continue to invest heavily in building things that that are providing funds and resources to the Chinese Communist Party? And then what does this kind of thinking do for the international community's view of support for defending Taiwan? So I think it's a healthy debate. It's a good debate. I'm a bit concerned, not when Gordon brings it up, because Gordon is an expert on these things and I trust him. And especially on the economic arena, I think there's a lot of pressure on Xi right now. But it's in terms of what it means for the PLA and this decade of concern where Xi is going to be faced between now and 2030, 2035, of making a decision on whether or not to use the military to bring Taiwan under their control, because the non-kinetic methods of trying to get Taiwan under control, whether it was economic or information or cognitive warfare, or those things, if those things don't bring Taiwan under their heel, they're going to be facing a decision matrix in Beijing and Zhongnanhai that says we got to make a decision to use the military. And as time goes on, up till about 2030, if they haven't resolved the Taiwan issue, there's going to be pressure to use the military. And every day we continue to see them practice to do that, or as Admiral Papero says, to rehearse to do that.
Yeah. Jim, thank you so much. Captain Fennell has made a number of points that I'd like to get others' thoughts on, maybe starting with you, Colonel Newsham. One of which is that the churn that we're seeing is actually part of a plan, not a feature, not a bug, as they say, that is designed to establish, well, I guess, control of the military for Xi, but also the optimal leadership of it, at least from his perspective. How do you see this, Grant? And more to the point, how does this fit in with what John Mills was talking about, which is, and Jim too, a military that may be good to go? 20, 30, 35 sounds like a long time, given the level of preparation at this point. Your thoughts, sir?
Yeah, I tend to agree with what Jim said, that the personnel movements, the churn, is pretty much part and parcel of a military, even a nice military. There's a lot of movement, but in a dictatorship like this, it's not surprising to have people come and go, and often really quickly and under questionable circumstances. But is this something different than, other similar militaries we've seen? If you think back to Germany, when Hitler was running the show, that there was all sorts of guys getting sacked and promoted, and there's a lot of infighting that you saw, and also saw, which is typical for those kind of regimes, but you saw it manifested in the German military, and yet throughout that entire period, it was still capable of causing us a lot more trouble than we wanted. And I think with the Chinese military, that I think something similar is going on. And I tend to look, maybe because we used to have similar jobs for a bit, I tend to look at what is the PLA demonstrably capable of. And if you watch what it's doing in the Pacific and elsewhere, and the level of skill and capability that's required, is something that's impressive, unfortunately. And one might say that the churn isn't having a whole lot of effect on, say, the military's growth trajectory and its ability to conduct these sorts of operations. So on that score, I think that it doesn't give me much grounds for sort of confidence that the Chinese have problems that are affecting their the ability to conduct military operations and to continue to develop. That seems to be on an upward growth trend, as long as the West and the Americans keep funding them. Alters that part of the equation, and things could be very different. I would also note that China has just the other day, it was announced they have defeated Starbucks in China. And Starbucks has learned the lesson that every business faces or is going to learn when it goes to China. Well, it's a little funny, but the internal fighting in this regime is kind of some ways normal. That you, in a certain sense, if you listen to old FBI recordings of the mafia in New York, you can see that they all hated the boss, and there was all sorts of under the table sort of criticism and plotting and scheming. But at the end of the day, the mafia, and in this case the Chinese Communist Party, and the military was still pretty potent in this time. So that's how I would look at it. And you always look at these things with there's always a sense that you're always looking over your back, thinking you've missed something, you're getting something wrong. And this is one of those cases, but I say I'm taking a little less consolation from the removals of Chinese military leaders than I would like, but I'm still pretty worried. Thank you.
Yeah. Brian Kennedy, you have been talking for some time about an aspect of Xi's preparations that is very concerning, I think, and suggests that it's not just the sort of order of battle of his PLA and Navy and rocket forces and so on, but that there is an enemy within component here inside the United States that could give him options to act, or perhaps a successor to act, perhaps again any moment. Could you comment on that particular piece and your thoughts more generally on where we stand with Xi and the prospects of conflict?
Yeah, thank you, Frank. And I would associate my whatever I have to say here with everyone who's spoken before me. I thought the remarks were excellent. I think Captain Fennell and Grant Newsom both were right on point. Let me say, one man cannot control 1.4 billion people. The party itself is 90 million people, if that's to be believed. The Chinese Communist Party has proved to be an extremely resilient, effective organization, capable of controlling those 1.4 billion people. The immediate people around Xi Jinping, that'll be in the tens of people. But those beyond that are in the thousands, in the tens of thousands, and the hundreds of thousands. They've constructed an apparatus in communist China to have a first world military capable of doing everything, Jim has said, and Grant has said, and John Mills, as well as being able to go to the moon, as well as being able to engage in diplomacy worldwide in very effective ways. John Mills mentioned Wang Huning, who I think is the number 3 person in the Politburo. He's said to have rigged the election in South Korea, or presumably been the mastermind. Whether he was or not is kind of irrelevant. He oversees part of a political apparatus within the party that is able to use the Chinese intelligence services very effectively abroad. These people are all loyal to communist China. Xi Jinping is certainly the secretary of all that, and he is a very big part of that. But they're operating today, it seems to me, as like a well-oiled machine. And whether or not that well-oiled machine sometimes has, problems, they look to be pretty capable of fixing those problems. Mm-hmm. They have all the inefficiencies of a communist system and a closed society. But still, they've managed an amazing thing here. And Xi Jinping, say what you will, has kept all of that running pretty well. And has been pretty, everyone always talks about his health. They'll talk about his health. He'll come out the next day and he always looks pretty robust to me. And, he didn't go to the BRICS meeting, but he probably figured, why bother? I mean, the world's on fire. Why do I really need to go to the BRICS meeting? They're pretty much doing what I want. I'm pretty sure he thinks. Mm-hmm. But back to Wang Huning. Wang Huning is the guy who wrote the book America versus America. Really studied the United States. And so he surrounds himself with really smart people. Xi Jinping does. And Wang understands the confrontations that we have here, and internal confrontations, with the various political groups. And I think Wang has been, pretty effective at guiding communist China and their intelligence service and their political apparatus against the United States. Joe Biden gets elected, it looks like, as I've always believed, with the help of the communist Chinese. Joe Biden opens up the border and imports into the country, President Trump says, 21 million people, a substantial portion of which are, Chinese nationals of military age that could be anywhere from 100,000 to 200,000 men. And you get reports of these guys coming across the border, and, sometimes we think of Chinese folks as being kind of diminutive, but in fact, these are big guys. A lot of them look like special forces. And, you know, you're 6 feet tall and pretty well put together, and there's thousands of you. Maybe you have a strategy, and maybe that strategy is to be everywhere you need to be to determine events to your liking. So whatever else is true of Xi Jinping, he's capable of organizing all that. And to keep the party together, the party could be evolving into an even more effective political structure. Now, that doesn't mean that, I mean, it's perfect. It's far from it. But they've adapted in some very remarkable ways. You look at the culture sometimes too in China. I was watching again the other day this Chinese movie called Born to Fly, and it was their response to our Top Gun movie with Tom Cruise. And it's you know, Xi Jinping does not feature at all in it, but the Chinese people in the movie, it's the Chinese military, they're able to build a 5th generation fighter aircraft. They're able to challenge the Americans. The virtues that get expressed in the movie, this was a big movie in communist China, the virtues that are expressed are of the individual, I won't call them citizens, they're not citizens, they're subjects of the Chinese Communist Party, but the men in the military are extremely capable and extremely unified and extremely family-oriented in the movie. And they embrace the virtues that made America great, ironically, back in the 40s and 50s. And they're trying to take those and bring them to communist China and to embrace their communist ideals and build a China that is great and powerful and the dominant force on earth. And all I would say, just to conclude my remarks, is that we have to be ever vigilant against communist China, because we somehow got in our minds that the inherent defects of communism would eventually just bring down all communist regimes. And it turns out with communist China, they have found, and I believe could continue to find, ways of adapting. And only unless they're challenged by the United States and forced to, you know, have to make certain kind of changes in how they operate, will they ever change, or will the party ever collapse? I don't mean to say that the party can't collapse. It's just that even if it does collapse, there'll be something replacing it that organizationally is very similar to what we have today. And it'll be a form of either military dictatorship or some other authoritarian regime that is capable of bringing together 1.4 billion people in a common cause. And that movie I was suggesting suggests that there is a common cause, which is to make communist China the most powerful nation on earth. So that whatever happens at the very top is not as consequential as the kind of developments and progress that Jim and Grant and John Mills were talking about.
Brian, thank you. That's a very interesting perspective and data set to mull as we're going through all of this. Which brings me to Karen Sigeman, who, as I mentioned, is focused on freedom. And Karen, I wanted to just explore with you what Brian has just laid out there. In addition to the political problems that the Chinese Communist Party is facing, not least of which arising from economic challenges that several of you have spoken to, there's also this demographic problem arising from basically the knock-on effects of their one-child policy. There's a lot of grounds for restiveness. Would you agree that, point one, that the Chinese people would probably, left to their own devices, default to just another authoritarian system, if not a communist one, something else? were the cumulative effects of all of these things, and then we ought to throw COVID probably and that nightmare on top of it all. Do you think that if Xi is indeed in any trouble as a result of all of those things, that there is an opportunity for the Chinese people to come out of this not as a threat to us, not as seeking global domination, maybe under a different leader and system, but still very much hostile to us?
It's a great and important question. First, just let me say it's been an extraordinary intelligence briefing that we've been privileged to participate in and that I get to be a part of. And the speculation to me just leads to a sense that there is tremendous unrest, there's uncertainty, there's potential chaos. But I also completely agree with the notion that this is all bigger than one man. Frank, to your question, could the Chinese people somehow come out of this in a more democratic America-looking way because of their demographic? I love thinking that that's the way things go. I think that there's been so much work because of the Chinese Communist Party, the PLA, Xi Jinping, the general ideology, the efforts, the money spent and expended globally in creating an infrastructure whose purpose is for global domination. Belt Road Initiative, for example, there in how many hundred, something countries. The work that's just been done here with buying farmland, with various kinds of agro-terrorism, building the Navy, positioning themselves in one direction or another with the island chains, money invested in our universities. In every way, they have been setting the stage for unrestricted warfare up to and including kinetic warfare. And I just don't see them turning that ship around. However it looks in the moment, I don't know there's lots of speculation here. We don't know how it's going to be, but I cannot see a squandering of that investment, of that effort, of that ideology. And not only those things, but here in the United States, and we talk about this all the time, there's a tremendous lack of awareness of any of this going on. As I've said, if war is being waged against you and you're not even aware, can you still lose? And we have, largely speaking, been losing. We had the balloon that went over the country. We had, and in particular, over military installations, we had drones. Every time we turn around, there's some new facet of Chinese power being infiltrated into our country. Fentanyl, TikTok, we know this whole litany. And we are so supremely unaware of it that it seems to me unrealistically optimistic to imagine that would not continue to be capitalized upon whoever continues to be or replaces Xi Jinping. Communism is bigger than one man. It is an ideology which is predicated on totalitarianism and undermining those of us who believe in freedom. You mentioned COVID, Frank. Part of how we've sort of capitulated to all of this is in, by the way, calling it COVID. We keep capitulating to preferred narratives. And why aren't we calling it the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus? We keep ceding ground in every possible way. And along with that ground, we are ceding freedom. We are seizing cognition of the actual situation. I like to imagine this is an opportunity for China, for the Lao Beijing, for the good people to have their America moment. I love what Brian said. They are embracing, at least on the surface, the values that made us great. And why are they the values that made us great? Because they are what makes a nation great. They are what contribute to freedom, to flourishing, to prosperity, to all good things. We seem to have lost the bubble on that, and they are now, at least in part, embracing it. They learned from the Cold War against the Soviet Union lessons about how much better to do things. And we seem to have forgotten everything that we learned. And to me, I think we need to continue to be absolutely vigilant, and we need to be proud of, cognizant of, courageous about, and confident in all those things that made us great and need to continue to make us great in the face of a threat that I can't imagine is actually dissipating, whatever condition Xi Jinping is in.
Thank you, Karen. Grant, John spoke a little bit about your travels in South Korea, and of course you're forward deployed in Japan. You have as good an appreciation of sort of the sentiment of our allies in the region as anybody, I suspect. First of all, how are they seeing this churning, for want of a better term, and is your reading of what they're thinking that a separate peace with the Chinese may be the prudent plan, irrespective of which of the communists term up, or maybe some other kind of totalitarian in their stead?
Please unmute.
Colonel Newsom. Oh, you are muted still, sir.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Well, where I've been, I haven't seen that anyone has a crystal clear idea of what is going on in the upper reaches of the Chinese Communist Party. There's the range of ideas, and they're not all that different than ours. But what you do find, and I'll speak for Korea and Japan, is you've got a huge constituency in the sort of the political class, even the business class to greater or lesser degrees, that actually thinks China is not a threat, that it is the better bet, and that some sort of an accommodation should be made. And in some cases, they want to make that accommodation really voluntarily. And as I said, that is both Japan and South Korea. Effectively, these are blocs that are agents of Chinese influence in both places. And what they are calibrating off of is how serious are the Americans. But we have taken the relationships that we have, say with the principal countries in Northeast Asia and elsewhere, as just rock solid, ironclad. You hear that expression a lot. And yet if you dig down, not at all. And what's going on in China, as I said, they don't quite know exactly. And they're really swaying with the wind a little bit. And I'm not exactly sure where they're going to come out. If you go down to ASEAN, it's not a whole lot better. So to me, it all just comes down to we'd better be ready to fight both militarily and economically, and relearn political warfare, and to do it fast. And if we do that, then you'll find that everybody's telling you, well, we were always on your side. We thought you were going to win. But that is a requirement that we get our acts together and fast.
Thank you. Jim Fennell, one of the things that jumps out at me is in that same vein, and be interested in, as you're following these things as closely as anybody, you've had the ongoing, several of you have mentioned this, the ongoing underwriting of our mortal enemy by Wall Street. As recently as May, this deal with cattle, for example, CATL. You've got the president enthusiastically supporting Iranian oil sales to China. You've got Israel being, it seems, told it can't decisively defeat its enemies and ours in another theater, yes, but allies of China, notably the Iranians. Is your sense, as Grant seems to be, that this is creating a sense of unease on the part of people that we're counting on to be important partners in resisting Chinese aggression?
Well, I think that's always a risk, Frank, but I think clearly this administration is turning back to what they did in the first administration, at least in terms of comparing them to the Obama, Biden, or even the Bush or Clinton years. So I think in that sense, I think people are more reassured, but there are a lot of questions. I see a lot of folks down in Australia are really, having concerns right now about the AUKUS agreement, and there's a lot of reporting coming out about senior members in the Pentagon saying we're going to do a review of AUKUS, and it's being interpreted, along political lines, but there's a lot of talk there about, is America going to stay consistent? Obviously what Grant and John did in Korea and that election. So there's questions out there. But on the other hand, America is stepping up. It's a balancing act. The president's got domestic concerns, getting the bill that they're voting on, hopefully, here in the next, before July 4th, I think is what the president wants. But the bottom line is there's domestic concerns that he has to balance off with and try to maneuver. So I'm not as critical about the short-term actions. I think we've talked before about what happened on the strike on Tehran and the kind of signal that sends. The fact that we used B-2s as diversion into the Pacific, Indo-Pacific, was a signal. So I think in that sense, people are reassured, that our allies are reassured that they know that we have a president that's not unwilling to act when he needs to. The question is, are we going to be able to deter Xi, whoever comes in, if Xi were to fall? I mean, if Gordon's right, if Gordon's right and Xi falls, then as we've been discussing and Brian mentioned, who are we going to get? And will they even be worse or will they be less? I don't know. But the system, the Chinese Communist Party and the Central Military Commission have built a pretty formidable force. And we need to be preparing ourselves for how do we deter them and how do we defeat them if we get in a fight here in the next 18 months. I was watching Kyle Bass on another podcast this week saying that he believes that in the next 18 months is the most critical time because it's about the time that we need, that the Pentagon is saying that they need to be able to upgun some of the critical systems that they need in AI and in drones and unmanned systems and things of that nature. I think we need more time when it comes to building capital ships and other things of that nature. Our stockpiles are depleted. So Xi is aware of that. Xi's aware of his own demographic challenges and an aging society and things of that nature, and his own economic vulnerability, again, that Gordon has documented very well. So we have a limited time set here to influence them. And that's the real challenge is, are we going to be able to do that and give the people of China some kind of hope that they're not going to be under the jackboot of the Chinese Communist Party? Because I believe, even though there's, the party's there and the party may replicate itself with somebody similar to Xi, there are a lot of Chinese there that don't like what happened in COVID. They didn't like being locked down and, and welded into their apartments and things of that nature, and the restrictions that they have. So I think the question is, how do we provide an alternative view to those folks that they can feel comfortable in knowing that there's another way? I'm not saying we lead a counter-revolution. That's up to them. But if we can at least provide them some hope, like we did with the dissidents in the Soviet Union during that Cold War, we know what they said. We know what Solzhenitsyn said, that when they saw President Reagan get up and speak, it generated hope and resistance from people in Soviet Union against the Soviet communists. We want to do the same for the people in China.
Yeah, this is, again, back to you, Karen, a freedom issue. One of the things that I must say I've been concerned about is that we've decided that we're going to stop broadcasting into Communist China and Mandarin, as I understand it, among other places where we're sort of standing down. And it's not to say that, there aren't problems with VOA or Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, what have you, but that this would seem an inopportune moment to be, essentially ceding the information battle space, which is, as you mentioned earlier, populated inside China, as well as here, for that matter, to a fairly well by the Chinese. What are your thoughts about this idea that we are we are not preparing or maintaining even the kind of capabilities that we should for the political warfare dimension of pushing back on these Chinese ambitions and threats.
Well, from the very beginning, the notion that it's warfare is inimical to how too many Americans see China, which has openly declared people's war on us. So I think we first need to recognize that, in fact, we are in a state of war with them one way or another, and then decide how to address it. And the things that you suggest are exactly right. Projection of soft power. There was a time these things were called coca-colonialism, which I always kind of admired, because the idea was we spread our products, if not our values, in a soft way. And I know that this is one of the tactics that we use against this, that helped bring the Soviet Union down. That kind of projection, how much were they willing to risk in order to get Levi's, for example. So to shut off communication is a terrible idea. Voice of America at one time, I do think, had tremendous value. Now, if it projects not our actual American values, but in fact theirs, I don't think there's value to it. But I always think that kind of projection of who we are, what our values are, what we believe in, and then give, to some extent, support, tacit or not, to those who would rather be on our side than not. It's always a good thing. I think we've always tried, we've always been the beacon around the world from even before we were a nation, that we are the shining city on the hill. To decide to squelch that vision of us, or to keep it under a barrel, or whatever your favorite imagery is, I think is not a good idea. And I don't think those tactics are excessive. If we are considering that we are in a war one way or another, finding those strategies of political warfare are all to the good, not only for us, but for them. But first, we do have to recognize that we are in a state of war with them and act accordingly.
Indeed. Brian, I want to bring you back to the home front for another run at this. You have been one of the most, I think, insistent people in the sort of public policy arena about the vulnerabilities of our electric grid. And in addition to having apparently sizable numbers of military personnel inside the country that could do immense harm to the grid, we also have this bizarre situation in which we're reliant on Chinese equipment inside the grid, in not just high voltage transformers, that's bad enough, but now also these solar farms and wind farms and batteries and the like, a number of which seem to have, mechanisms for controlling them or even perhaps destroying them remotely. Could you comment on this piece of the preparation that Xi has made, again, in this case, with our acquiescence, if not deliberate complicity, and how this would play into the kind of strategy that Xi, or perhaps another bent on our destruction, could exercise?
Yeah, it's a great question. But of course, the penetration of the United States economically and the takeover of our electric grid and the manufacture of the large transformers and the computers that run all those things, that was decades in the making, of course. That preceded Xi Jinping. This is a long-term strategy of Communist China to intertwine itself economically with the United States and manufacture for us those critical components that we need for our survival. And it's been utterly suicidal on our part that we've let that happen. And the Communist Chinese know today that Donald Trump may be an America First president, but he may not last. They're pretty confident about their own system, which is, let me be clear, very defective, obviously. It's an evil system of government that exists in communist China. And its evil is visited upon the people of communist China to varying degrees of savagery every day. What they think is, we've got China under control. What does it take to control America? Well, let's manufacture all their goods. They seem kind of lazy anyway. So we'll be the manufacturer for them. And they don't want to build even the most sensitive components of their military system. So let's produce those for them too. Let's produce their medicines. Let's do all these things. The Chinese, you could say, if I'm being provocative, operate with a certain confidence that they know they've got this system wired on their behalf, and that Donald Trump is a bit of a phenomenon who's going to pass. He won't be here forever. And the trend in American politics is much more likely to go back to some kind of a globalist who is willing to let the Chinese still be the manufacturing platform for the United States, and will let the United States, as it were, engage in these foreign wars that sap them of their strength and don't allow them to turn their efforts, the way Karen was describing, on China itself. The thing that will be beneficial to the Chinese people, by the way, is a very strong United States, economically and militarily. That will give them hope. Nothing else will. To the extent that we allow our leaders in this country to continue the folly of not having a manufacturing base in the United States capable of providing absolutely mission-critical items for the United States, if we can't rectify that, the people of China will think we're fools. We're also going through this period in this country, of course, where we're going from, we were a republic, and then we became, in my judgment, a kind of empire that engaged in wars that were not designed for the immediate benefit of the American people, but for some global ambition that was very ill-defined. China and the rest of the world sees us as dangerous, right? Not under President Trump, maybe not even under George Bush, but under Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Bill Clinton, even the kind of things George Bush did, they serve the interest of other nations, not that of the United States. The problem is we lack clarity here at home about what's good for us. Islam is not a religion of peace. We're in the middle of the lights go out in my office, by the way, because Gavin Newsom here in the state has rules that if you don't move enough, every 20 minutes the lights go out. We're a country foolish with stupid laws like that, and with a stupid class of political leader that is not putting the interests of the United States first. If there is one thing, I'd want to impress upon folks, is that the Chinese understand us better than we understand ourselves. And we understand them very little. We Americans are living over here on this beautiful country of ours, completely devoid of what is going on in much of the world. We want to do things, we want to live our private lives. We live in a republic, we think. We want to elect people to go to Washington, represent us, and make sure we're defended. That today is not happening. And until we wake up the American people to this, that we need to manufacture things here in the United States, we still need today to have a first world and a first class military. For everybody who thinks we can defend the United States on the cheap, they're wrong. We can't. We can do it more efficiently, but we can't do it on the cheap. We've got to be the best in the world. Because if not, communist China or Russia, in concert together, using a variety of surrogates like Iran or North Korea or others, will try to take us down. And we're here on the eve of the 4th of July. People need to understand that this precious thing that we call American freedom is precious. And it's in the great history of the world, nations like ours don't survive. I believe if we can get the message that we've been talking about in this webinar and others out to enough people in this country, they'll understand this is a country that can rally and do all the right things. We can build things again. We could build new cities. We can have a prosperous and free country, but it requires common sense, making sure we get rid of all the illegal aliens that are here, and building the country economically and militarily to make sure that we remain free. That's the highest good, freedom.
Amen. Brian, if I could just ask a quick round from all of you, as we're about out of time, on essentially what you've just described, and we've talked about it on this program and elsewhere regularly, but building things again, and in particular building ships, near and dear to Captain Fennell's heart, especially, and I think Colonel Newsom's, to all of us. But having an industrial base capable of providing what we need to secure ourselves and freedom, as you've indicated, Brian, is it seems very much a controversial proposition these days. We're hearing from even quarters that I must tell you I'm astonished at, that the military-industrial complex is all about fostering needless wars in the Middle East in particular at the moment. But I can hear the same thing being said of Asia in due course. And I would just ask each of you to take a minute or so to just comment on whether we have one defense industrial base, and if we are to make the military of the United States great again, and if we are to ensure we have a shot at least at properly defending ourselves, deterring aggression as well, we're going to need that industrial base. And I would just appreciate your thoughts as to whether we are creating conditions under which popular support for it, deep suspicion about it, and unwillingness to ensure that it is functioning as needed. Shipbuilding being, again, a prime example of deficiencies in that respect. What are your thoughts as to whether, when we look at the China threat, when we look at it under whichever leadership it has, communists, Xi, somebody else, not communists, as we discussed here, can we in fact fulfill what Brian, I think, sensibly argued for just now, if we are not attending to this key industrial capability and making it, great again as well? Captain, can we start with you?
Yeah, Frank. I think what Brian said is really the strategic issue of what it is we're trying to do to get across to the American people how important this is. And I put out a video earlier today I saw from the internet. It was about a man in Alabama who's an engineer, comes from an engineering family. His family in the 50s and 60s, his parents worked in a factory making things. And he was trying to make a simple scrubber for your grill. We're getting a couple of days, I'm going to put my brisket on and grill my brisket that I do every 4th of July. And you want to have a nice scrubber. And so he was saying that the scrubbers that are out there are all cheap and made to be disposable. And so he set about trying to make one that could be made in America, industrial strength, and that would be, something that would be reflective of the American spirit, ingenuity, engineering capability. It's like a 48-minute video. And he basically went through the whole process, extremely amount of effort to get things made in America. And at the very end, he still couldn't do it because things that he thought he was getting that were not made in China were actually made in China. Mm-hmm. And so you come across this sense that, at least when I grew up, my father helped build the house that I lived in, and he was an electrical engineer, so he did all the electrical wiring. We removed 2 engines from a car that we had, a VW bus, and we replaced those engines as I grew up. Things that we could do with our hands and our minds, and we didn't have to have done it before, but we could, go to a J.C. Whitney's manual and book and buy the parts and figure it out. And today we don't have that capability, it seems, in certain areas, especially when we look at places like our Ivy League institutions and the protests that we see there and the preponderance of degrees that they're getting. And I juxtapose my growing up, I'm 62, growing up in that kind of environment where my father could do things, anything he could do. And then I'm looking at an article right now from China Daily today. It's called Solo Economy, Being Alone is Not Lonely. And it says, welcome to the Millennial Generation Z me world. More and more people are now eating alone, traveling alone, and living alone. Not because society is broken, but because they have discovered something truly magical. Being with other people can be tiring. And then it goes on to talk about eating alone. But it puts forward it's a communist ideology that basically says, we know who you are, as Brian said. They know us better than we know ourselves. And they've got us addicted to these phones and this technology. And children that grew up in COVID, in their high school or college years, and they're going off to the job market, they don't know how to look somebody in the eye. They don't know how to talk with their friends. They're doing everything on texts and apps and TikTok and Instagram and all this stuff. And we're losing that spirit of innovation and can-do spirit that made us the nation that we were. And so how do we bring that back? That's the real question. And part of it is people with gray beards and gray hair telling the new generation that it's really important to defend yourself because there are bad people out there that want to take away the lifestyle that you have or the security that you have and force their worldview on you. And it's not going to be free. You saw Brian, his lights go out. I live in Europe. The lights go out if you don't move. I mean, it's centralized control from a small oligarch few, like we see in Brussels or Washington, that want to tell everybody else how to live. That is China personified with the Chinese Communist Party. And it's not going to turn out well for us. And we saw what happened in the great proletarian leap forward and the Cultural Revolution. These people are vicious when they get in control. And if we think that they're not going to be vicious in America when they start controlling our institutions, think again. So we need to get back into the kinds of things that we've been talking about. And as it relates to military, we need to grow that industrial base. I just saw a note that came across the wire. We're stopping sending munitions to Ukraine right now, not because we don't like Ukraine, but because we don't have enough for ourselves. We've depleted ourselves. It's insane. We've got to turn this around.
Amen. Colonel, I'm going to come back to you. Karen, any thoughts on this issue of, the arsenal of democracy, I guess one might call it, at least in the past, and its viability today and need in the future, and how we're characterizing it to current generation?
Well, I do think that the supply chain issue was just brought up is one of our greatest vulnerabilities. We've talked about this. They can cut off anything at any time, electromagnetic, any kind of supplies, medical supplies, for example, but also the componentry of our military. And as to the military, that we have let our all of our military get into such decline is an appalling thing, while at the same time China has been doing the opposite. But the other aspect of how unprepared we are and how vulnerable we are is the attack on the very idea of war fighting. And I'm going to add on how masculinity is now seen as toxic. So the very idea of warriorness, of fighting to win, of having a military poised not only to fight, but again, to be victorious, that this is seen as evil, somehow an extension of some bad characteristics. that really has to change. So the fact that our military itself, in terms of the product, in terms of intelligence, in terms of ships and various componentry, that's bad enough, but that we have gotten to the point where we see even war fighting as a bad thing in itself, that scares me, that it's been so emasculated and that it's been ruled by DEI again, rather than victory in war. On the other hand, when Top Gun, the most recent, not the most recent, the one prior, Maverick came out during the Chinese virus, everyone was concerned that Hollywood was dead. How do we get people back into the theaters? Even before it was going downhill, during the virus, it was even worse. When Top Gun Maverick came out, it was such an unbelievably blockbuster of a just, it was a phenomenon. People were seeing it 10, 15, 20 times in the theater on purpose. And I would contend it's because there was something masculine about it. There was war fighting, there was victory, there was excitement. We didn't know who the enemy was, but by God, we were going to defeat them. And that, to me, showed me that if we could just get up the courage and the confidence to tap into that sense of who we are, again, being serious about who we are as a nation, again, recognizing that there are bad guys out there who we must defeat, again, and that all of this is actually a good thing, and it brings us and the world, by the way, freedom. It is inherent in us, and if we can just tap into that, I think it's nothing but a good thing.
Yeah, thank you. Colonel, I wanted to save you for last because you've had the experience of working in a defense-relevant industry. You have shared with me and others your experiences with Motorola and the takedown of that company, among many others, the whole sector really, by the Chinese. What are your thoughts about both the physical needs for a manufacturing base in this country and the implications I personally see for rebuilding it and having it available for the needed, retooling of our armed forces and our national security more generally. If we continue to deprecate, it as a component of our manufacturing and commercial capabilities.
Well, sometimes if you turn it on its head, you get a clearer sense of things. Now, suppose that China was as dependent on us as we are for them on all these things, including just huge amounts of just militarily necessary components, ingredients, and not to mention, say, our grid, like Brian Kennedy has been sounding the alarm forever, pharmaceuticals. Suppose it was reversed. We would give China nothing but the back of our hand. You would not take them seriously. You would know that when push came to shove, that we could take them because there's nothing they could do. And they'd look at us and they must be laughing. This is ultimately a great act of betrayal by our elite class over the last 30 years, to sell out to China like this. Now, I'd like to think, however, that America can turn on a dime, and we've done it before in the past, and I think we could do it again. You mentioned Motorola, for whom I used to work. We had the world's leading semiconductor operation going, one of the very top, and it's this huge ecosystem in Scottsdale, Arizona, and some other places. And we had plenty of engineers. We had this kind of smart people who make this stuff, and we dominated. And then we decided we didn't like it. And once again, I remember it because it was the CEO, the CFO class, the MBA types who said, well, it's not a core competency. Only losers manufacture stuff. We'll just design. And we gave the thing away. And but that wasn't all that long ago. So I think we could easily come back and do it again. We do make it hard on ourselves. And when it comes to the underlying sort of American, sort of that spirit of America, I've probably written, I don't know, 1 million or 2 words about China stuff in defense. Yeah. But when that Chinese balloon came over America the other year, that people looked up and said, what the hell is going on with China? That had more effect than everything I've written, and I would suggest that everyone else on earth has ever written about China. Americans looked up and said, we don't like this. And they were clamoring, and they even forced the Biden administration to do something. The Biden administration, of course, did nothing until it didn't make any difference, and then they suppressed the results of what they found inside the balloon, which would have been mostly American hardware, no doubt. But once again, it shows how America can turn, and we got a good hand to play. And I could say this all day, but I wish we'd play it a lot sooner than we have. It does take some leadership. I've been watching for 30 years at least for one of America's perfume princes who have a row of ribbons that would embarrass Zhukov, yet haven't won a war. Which one of them has spoken up and said we should not be dependent on this enemy that's out to kill us? I would suggest it's a very short list, and it may have like 0 people on it, even though some people thought it. So I'm actually, I'm optimistic, but as I said, it's getting late in the game. It's sort of being down by the Yankees, in the bottom of the 7th. You'd rather be up. And so that's my take on it. The last point, you mentioned we were the A team. When it comes to trying to figure out Xi Jinping's longevity, I pity the fool. I pity the fool. It's if you remember that show. But it's a hard thing to do. But the point is, it almost doesn't matter. What matters is that we get our acts together and do it quickly. Yeah.
Amen. Brian, a final word from you to just wrap us up.
Yeah, look, I agree with everything that's just been said. We can turn on a dime. It will require President Trump, who is an amazing leader who can think about the common sense of this whole thing. It will require him having the will to push Congress and our military to invest the necessary money to build the things that Jim and Grant would tell us we need. If we did that at the pace we need to do it, we will, by definition, rebuild our industrial base. My own criticisms of our military industrial complex is that it's not very industrious. If they were really that powerful, we wouldn't be in this pickle. Now, they weren't the ones who got us into the wars, and they weren't the ones who kept us in the wars. It was bad judgments by our political leaders who were misguided about things we should do, whether it was Iraq or Afghanistan. If it was right to go into Iraq, it was right to go in, reduce them, and get out of there. It's been the democracy projects, as it were, in those countries, thinking we can turn people into Democrats, as you've so brilliantly described time and again, Frank. That was where we made our mistake, thinking we can turn these people into Americans. They're not Americans. We're Americans. If we, in a commonsensical way today, just look at what will be required to secure the United States from all enemies, foreign and domestic, it will, with absolute clarity, be the rebuilding of our industrial base. President Trump believes that, but we have to do it at a pace that is realistic, meaning urgently. And the other side knows they can wait out Donald Trump. And so they're going to do everything they can to bide their time. And if you're communist China, you'll think, okay, he'll be here 4 years. Then he'll go. The next guy is very likely to just go back to the old ways. President Trump's going to need to describe to the American people what greatness looks like and the sacrifices, if necessary, that will have to be made. It's going to cost a lot. Fine. We'll cut it out other things if need be. But we've not got clarity on what it takes to rebuild this country. Part of the job of the president will be to make that case. I think he understands it, and it'll be our task to help defend him and what will be required intellectually here to this audience and to the American people. And thank you, Frank, for organizing this on this 4th of July weekend.
Well, I appreciate all of you participating in it, Brian. Thank you for summarizing so brilliantly, as always. I would just say, if we are intent on educating the American people, if we are intent on arousing them and enlisting their help, their sacrifice, yes, but most especially, I guess, their tax dollars to do the sorts of things that each of you has talked about, it would sure help to win a war. And my biggest fear about deprecating, as I say, the military-industrial complex in the context of, CENTCOM and an endless war in Asia is, in the Middle East rather, is that it undermines, I fear, the popular sense that these things do matter. Winning does matter, and we haven't done enough of it, despite the best efforts of our men and women in uniform, usually, for far too long. So I would just, on the eve of this 4th of July, when we both mark and hopefully enthusiastically recommit ourselves to the idea of freedom and this nation as a bulwark for it in the world, I hope we will be graced by victory, our own or our allies in the Middle East, as well as an effective deterrent to Xi or anybody else that might emerge from communist China and be tempted to take advantage of the current correlation of forces, which they've been assiduously building up. And we've been allowing them to do so without requisite corresponding action on our part. So with that, I want to just say to Gordon Chang, John Mills, Jim Fennell, to Grant Newsham, Karen Sigerman, Brian Kennedy, thank you. You are the A-team, and I think we've turned in collectively an A-class performance, and I thank you for doing so, and hopefully it will inspire all those listening and those that will in the future to remember what the 4th of July is all about and make sure that we have more of them in the future by doing our part. God bless you all. Didi, back to you.
Barry? Thank you, Frank, and thanks to all of our panelists for being here today, and most especially to you, our audience. A video of this webinar will be posted to presentdangerchina.org within a day of our program's conclusion. Please share this and our other programs with your elected representatives, colleagues, and other networks. For webinar notices, updates, and news, subscribe to our Substack at presentdangerchina.substack.com and follow us on X at CPD China. Join us again next week for another installment of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world, and how CCP captured elites betray the USA. Thanks for joining us today. Have a great Independence Day. Bye-bye.